Stop. Stop ignoring the warning signs in your feet. Right now, just stop. Because what I'm about to show you changes everything about what you think normal aging feels like. That tingling in your toes, those nighttime leg cramps, the cold feet that never seem to warm up. You've been told those things are harmless. They're not. I'm Dr. Emma Whitmore, and after more than 3 decades as a vascular surgeon, I have held arteries in my hands that look decades older than the patient they came from. I have opened legs where the blood supply had been silently disappearing for years. And what I need you to understand is this. You believe those small symptoms are simply part of getting older. You're wrong. They are evidence. Evidence that your circulatory system may already be under siege. By the time I finish explaining this investigation, you will never look at cold feet, heavy legs, or nighttime cramps the same way again. When Robert arrived in my operating room, his right foot had already turned a dull greyish blue. The tissue was starving. Blood flow had collapsed. But to understand how Robert ended up on that table, I need to take you back 5 years earlier. Robert was 71, recently retired, active. He walked every morning, followed his doctor's advice, and believed he was doing everything right. The only strange thing he noticed was a mild tingling sensation in his toes when he sat too long. Later came occasional cramps in his calves at night, then the cold feet. Even in warm rooms, his toes felt like ice. What nobody told Robert was that every single day, deep inside his arteries, a silent infiltration was underway. Blood vessels are not simple pipes. They are living tissue lined with specialized cells called endothelial cells that regulate blood flow. And when those cells begin to fail, the entire circulatory network becomes a battlefield. Here's what I see when I operate on someone like Robert, who has been losing circulation slowly for years. The artery walls are stiff, inflamed, and narrowed. Blood struggles to move forward. Oxygen never reaches the tissue that depends on it. The culprit in many of these cases is something called endothelial dysfunction. Think of it as a communications breakdown inside your blood vessels. Normally, these cells produce a molecule called nitric oxide that tells the artery to relax and widen. But when that system falters, the vessel tightens instead of opening. Blood slows, pressure rises, and the legs, being the farthest territory from the heart, become the first casualties in this quiet war. Your body tries to compensate. It reroutes flow. It sends inflammatory signals. But if the underlying mechanism continues, the siege tightens year after year. Tingling becomes numbness. Cramping becomes pain when walking. Skin turns pale or bluish, and eventually tissue begins to die, not suddenly, gradually, quietly. Robert didn't lose circulation overnight. It took years. Because endothelial dysfunction is only the first mechanism in this investigation. There is a second force working behind it, one that accelerates the damage and turns slow circulation into a full-scale vascular crisis. And almost nobody talks about it. Now let's examine the crime scene properly, because what we saw in Robert's leg was not random damage. It was the predictable result of a system under attack for years. When I open an artery affected by poor circulation, the inside does not look smooth and flexible the way a healthy vessel should. Instead, the surface is rough, inflamed, narrowed, almost like a battlefield where repeated assaults have scarred the terrain. Blood no longer glides through. It struggles forward in a restricted channel. The first mechanism was endothelial dysfunction, the failure of those delicate endothelial cells to produce enough nitric oxide to keep vessels relaxed. But that mechanism rarely acts alone. There is almost always a second force advancing behind it, like an invading army exploiting a weakened defense line. That second mechanism is cholesterol infiltration and plaque formation, driven by low-density lipoprotein particles, commonly called LDL cholesterol. Now pause this video for a moment and write that down. Endothelial dysfunction weakens the artery wall, and LDL infiltration takes advantage of that weakness. Think of your artery like a fortress wall protecting the territory of your tissues. When the endothelial layer is functioning normally, it acts like disciplined guards controlling what enters and exits. But when those guards are weakened by inflammation, aging, or metabolic stress, LDL particles begin slipping through the cracks in the wall. Once inside the arterial lining, they become oxidized. This is where the immune system enters the battle. White blood cells called macrophages rush to the scene, attempting to eliminate the oxidized LDL like soldiers responding to a breach. But instead of clearing the threat, they become overwhelmed. They swallow the cholesterol, transform into foam cells, and begin accumulating inside the artery wall. Layer by layer, these foam cells build a plaque deposit that narrows the vessel from the inside. This process is not theoretical. It is the exact tissue structure we see under a microscope. In fact, researchers described this mechanism decades ago. A large investigation published in the journal Circulation followed thousands of patients with peripheral arterial disease for several years. The finding was stark. Individuals with elevated LDL levels had dramatically higher rates of arterial plaque formation in the lower limbs. Not a small effect, not a statistical curiosity, a measurable and consistent increase in vascular blockage. Let me put that in real terms. When plaque grows inside the arteries supplying your legs, the muscles and nerves that depend on that blood supply begin to starve for oxygen. That is when the symptoms you were told to ignore start appearing. Tingling in the toes, cramping in the calves while walking, feet that remain cold even when the rest of your body feels warm. These are not random sensations. They are distress signals from tissues that are slowly being deprived of circulation. Let me take you to another case that illustrates this mechanism clearly. When Patricia came into my clinic, she was 68 years old and still working part-time as a librarian. She had followed every piece of advice she had been given. She avoided smoking, took her medications, and walked regularly. Yet she had developed a strange pattern of pain in her calves whenever she walked more than a block. The pain disappeared when she stopped. Classic intermittent claudication. But to understand how Patricia reached that point, we have to rewind about 3 years earlier. At that time, she had begun noticing mild heaviness in her legs by the evening. Occasionally, her toes would feel numb after sitting too long. Her doctor reassured her it was likely age or mild nerve irritation. What nobody explained was that inside the arteries supplying her legs, plaque was already accumulating millimetre by millimetre. Every month, the passageway carrying blood grew slightly narrower. Eventually, the restriction reached a tipping point. Her leg muscles demanded more oxygen during walking, but the narrowed arteries could not deliver it fast enough. The result was pain, not because her muscles were injured, but because they were suffocating during activity. When we performed vascular imaging on Patricia, the scans revealed multiple areas of plaque buildup in the femoral arteries that supply the lower limbs. It was not bad luck. It was the natural progression of endothelial dysfunction followed by LDL infiltration. But the investigation does not stop there, because even those two mechanisms together do not fully explain why circulation collapses so dramatically in some individuals while others remain stable. There is a third layer to this story, and it involves a nutrient that most people never associate with circulation at all. Before I reveal it, I want you to do something. Go to your kitchen, open your pantry or refrigerator, and look for foods rich in vitamin B3, also known as niacin. Chicken, salmon, tuna, eggs, peanuts, whole grains, mushrooms. Take note of them. Then come back. Because what I'm about to show you in the next part connects endothelial dysfunction, cholesterol infiltration, and circulatory collapse in a way most people have never seen explained. And once you understand that third mechanism, the entire case finally makes sense. Now we arrive at the third layer of this investigation, the mechanism that quietly links the first two together and determines whether the siege on your circulation accelerates or slows down. We already examined endothelial dysfunction, the breakdown of the artery's protective lining, and we followed the trail of LDL infiltration that builds plaque deposits inside those weakened vessels. But there is another player involved, one that rarely gets discussed outside metabolic research, and that is the molecule called nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, commonly abbreviated as NAD. This compound is produced in your body from vitamin B3, also known as niacin, and it functions as a critical coenzyme inside almost every cell responsible for energy production and metabolic repair. When NAD levels decline, the cellular machinery that maintains vascular health begins to stall. Imagine the circulatory system as a defensive fortress where every wall, gate, and watchtower requires constant maintenance crews. NAD functions like the fuel supply that powers those crews. Without it, repairs slow down, damage accumulates, and the fortress walls begin to crumble faster than they can be restored. Endothelial cells lose their efficiency. Nitric oxide production drops. The vessels stiffen, and the infiltrating LDL particles we discussed earlier gain even easier access to the arterial lining. This is why aging changes the equation so dramatically. As the body grows older, NAD production naturally declines. Studies have measured reductions of more than 50% between early adulthood and late life. That decline weakens the metabolic defenses of the vascular system. Researchers writing in the journal Nature Communications described how reduced NAD levels impair endothelial nitric oxide synthase, the enzyme responsible for producing nitric oxide. When that enzyme slows down, arteries lose their ability to widen properly. The vessels become rigid instead of responsive. Blood flow becomes restricted exactly where it needs to increase the most. Let me put that in plain terms. When NAD levels drop, the body loses one of its primary tools for keeping arteries flexible and well supplied with energy. That makes endothelial dysfunction worse and accelerates plaque buildup at the same time. Three mechanisms now feeding each other: endothelial damage, cholesterol infiltration, and metabolic energy collapse inside the vascular wall. And once all three mechanisms are operating together, circulation begins to deteriorate much faster than most people realize. This is where the symptoms we discussed earlier become more than occasional inconveniences. Tingling becomes persistent numbness. Cold feet remain cold even in warm environments. Minor cuts on the toes take longer and longer to heal because oxygen delivery is compromised. Before I go further, pause this video and think about your own body for a moment. Have you noticed nighttime cramps in your calves? Do your feet stay colder than the rest of you? Do your legs feel unusually heavy by the evening after a day of standing or walking? These are not minor annoyances. They are signals from tissues asking for more blood supply than they are receiving. Let me show you exactly how this mechanism played out in another patient I treated. When Gerald arrived at the hospital, he was 74 years old and had been experiencing worsening leg fatigue for months. The immediate crisis that brought him to medical attention was a small wound on his big toe that refused to heal. It had been there for weeks. The skin around it had begun turning dark. But to understand how Gerald reached that point, we need to rewind about 4 years earlier. Gerald had been an active warehouse supervisor who walked miles every day at work. He began noticing that his feet sometimes felt strangely cold when he sat down at night. Later, he developed occasional tingling in his toes. His doctor suspected mild nerve irritation and recommended stretching and hydration. What no one measured was the gradual decline in vascular flexibility occurring inside his arteries. Over time, endothelial dysfunction had reduced nitric oxide signaling. LDL particles were depositing plaque along the vessel walls. Meanwhile, his metabolic repair systems were weakening as NAD production declined with age and diet. The three mechanisms combined like coordinated attackers, breaching a fortress gate from different directions. Eventually, the blood supply to his toes dropped below the threshold needed for proper tissue repair. That is why the wound on Gerald's toe would not heal. When we examined his circulation with vascular imaging, we saw narrowed arteries struggling to deliver blood to the lower foot. The damage was not mysterious. It was the predictable outcome of the three mechanisms we just investigated. But here is the critical turning point in this case. When those mechanisms are addressed simultaneously, circulation does not simply stop deteriorating, it can improve. Endothelial cells regain some of their signaling capacity, blood vessels widen more effectively, oxygen delivery increases. That is the moment where patients begin reporting warmer feet, fewer nighttime cramps, and greater endurance when walking. But improvement only occurs when all three mechanisms are targeted at the same time. Addressing one while ignoring the others leaves the siege partially intact. That is why the protocol I'm about to explain focuses specifically on restoring vascular signaling, supporting metabolic repair pathways linked to NAD production, and reducing the factors that accelerate plaque accumulation. Before I reveal the exact details, I need you to do one thing. Screenshot this moment in the video or write down the three mechanisms we uncovered in this investigation: endothelial dysfunction, cholesterol infiltration, and NAD decline. Those three processes form the foundation of everything that comes next, because in the final part of this case, I'm going to show you the complete protocol that targets each mechanism directly and explains why something as simple as vitamin B3 has attracted so much attention in circulatory research. But there is one more detail you must understand before we lay out that strategy. Timing matters. The earlier the siege is interrupted, the easier it is for the body to restore circulation to the tissues that depend on it. Now we reach the final stage of this investigation, the point where evidence turns into action. We have identified the three mechanisms driving circulation decline in the legs and feet: endothelial dysfunction, reducing nitric oxide signaling; LDL infiltration, building plaque inside weakened arteries; and the metabolic slowdown associated with declining NAD levels that limits the body's ability to maintain vascular health. These forces operate together like coordinated attackers surrounding a fortress. If you push back against only one, the other two continue their advance. But when all three are addressed at the same time, the battlefield changes. Blood vessels regain flexibility, circulation improves, oxygen delivery increases. That is why the protocol I'm about to outline is designed as a coordinated strategy rather than a single isolated step. Component 1 targets endothelial dysfunction directly, and that component is vitamin B3 in its biologically active form, known as niacin. Niacin plays a unique role because it participates in the biochemical pathway that generates NAD, the molecule we discussed earlier that fuels cellular repair systems. When niacin enters the body, it contributes to NAD production and supports enzymes involved in vascular signaling, including endothelial nitric oxide synthase. That enzyme is responsible for producing nitric oxide, the molecule that instructs arteries to relax and widen so blood can pass through more efficiently. In practical terms, supporting NAD production through adequate vitamin B3 intake helps restore the metabolic energy required for vascular repair. Research has examined this relationship for decades. One widely cited investigation published in the Journal of Clinical Lipidology examined the effects of niacin on vascular function and lipid metabolism. Participants receiving niacin demonstrated improvements in cholesterol balance, including measurable reductions in LDL cholesterol and increases in HDL cholesterol. Not a small shift, not a marginal statistical signal, a meaningful improvement in lipid profiles that influence plaque formation. Let me translate that into real-world consequences. When LDL levels fall and HDL levels rise, the rate at which plaque accumulates inside arteries slows down. At the same time, niacin's effect on vasodilation allows existing blood vessels to expand slightly, improving the passage of oxygen-rich blood to tissues in the lower limbs. But there is a detail many people overlook. Niacin works best when it is supported by lifestyle patterns that reduce vascular strain. That brings us to component 2 of the protocol, regular movement. The human circulatory system evolved for motion. Muscles act as auxiliary pumps that help return blood from the legs back toward the heart. When individuals sit for prolonged periods, that pump system becomes inactive and blood tends to pool in the lower limbs. Standing up, stretching, and walking periodically reactivates that muscular assistance and improves venous return. Even brief walking intervals throughout the day can help restore circulation patterns that stagnate during long periods of sitting. Component 3 addresses hydration and nutrient balance. Blood itself is a fluid system that depends on proper hydration to maintain flow characteristics. When hydration is inadequate, blood viscosity increases slightly, making circulation less efficient. Consistent fluid intake, combined with balanced nutrition, supports the transport of oxygen and nutrients throughout the body. Foods naturally rich in vitamin B3 contribute to this process. Chicken breast, salmon, tuna, eggs, mushrooms, peanuts, and whole grains all provide niacin along with additional micronutrients that support metabolic health. Before I continue, pause for a moment and think about your daily routine. When was the last time you stood up and walked after sitting for more than an hour? How often do foods rich in vitamin B3 appear in your weekly meals? These questions matter because circulation is influenced by daily patterns repeated over months and years. Let me show you what happens when those patterns change. Raymond was 71 when he began experiencing persistent coldness in his feet and occasional cramps during evening walks. The symptoms were not dramatic enough to force an emergency visit, but they were noticeable. Instead of ignoring them, Raymond focused on the same mechanisms we have discussed. He adjusted his diet to include more foods rich in vitamin B3, increased his daily walking intervals, and paid closer attention to hydration. Over the following months, he reported gradual changes. His feet felt warmer in the evenings, the heaviness in his legs diminished, and his walking distance increased before fatigue appeared. These improvements were not miracles, they were the expected result of restoring conditions that support healthy circulation. Now I want to address several questions that often arise when people hear this information. First, some individuals wonder whether their physician would disagree with this approach. In reality, the mechanisms we discussed, endothelial function, cholesterol balance, and metabolic repair pathways, are widely documented in cardiovascular research. Presenting these findings as part of a conversation with a healthcare professional can open useful discussions about personal risk factors and preventive strategies. Second, people often ask whether dietary changes and movement patterns truly matter compared with medical interventions. The answer lies in simple arithmetic. Lifestyle factors influence circulation every day for decades. Even small improvements applied consistently across years can shape vascular health significantly. Third, some ask whether focusing on one element alone is sufficient, but as we established earlier, these mechanisms reinforce each other. Addressing circulation effectively means supporting endothelial function, maintaining balanced cholesterol levels, and sustaining metabolic repair systems simultaneously. Before you leave this video, I want you to do something important. Share this information with someone who often complains about cold feet, nighttime leg cramps, or persistent heaviness in their legs. Those symptoms are frequently dismissed as normal aging, yet they can signal early changes in circulation that deserve attention. Awareness is the first step toward prevention, and if you found this investigation useful, stay connected for the next case we will examine, because circulation does not operate in isolation. The vascular system interacts with metabolism, nerve health, and immune signaling in ways that most people never learn about until problems appear. Understanding those connections may change the way you view everyday symptoms and the simple habits that influence long-term cardiovascular health.